Dr. Smaildon.
Hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure for me to be back here today. You know that it's always very dangerous to ask historians to talk about the future. Our record is not so good. But I'll present maybe a few possible scenarios, and then we can see which one might be more likely. But what I'm going to do today is divide my comments up into three parts. The first part will deal a little bit with the foundations of the EU and what I regard as the seeds of its contemporary problems. The second part will consist of a description of what I think are the most important problems of the EU today, some of which overlap with what you saw in the film, but some of which do not. And then the third part will talk about some possibilities for the future. My understanding is that we usually take a break here around 25 after. Right? So I'll see how I'm doing here, and if I think it's a good time to end sort of the first phase or the first part, I'll stop it and maybe field a few questions, and then we can have a break, and then we'll complete the thing afterward. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. All right, so as you heard in the film, the contemporary EU, which was founded in 1992, has a long history. In fact, it goes back to the period before the Second World War. People in the interwar period were dreaming, some people were dreaming of a kind of United States of Europe. That didn't get very far. First, you had to defeat the fascists and so on. But then, in the rubble of Europe at the end of the Second World War, the project of bringing Europe together finally got some legs. The first really strong institutional example of this was the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community. And that community first consisted of 6 states: West Germany, France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Italy, and the Netherlands. And its aim was to prevent war and to promote European unity by encouraging economic cooperation and interdependence in key economic sectors. Interestingly, it was really being driven by the French, by people like Jean Monnet and Robert Schuman. And it's also interesting that it's in France where you had some of the most tenacious resistance to the construction of a more unified Europe. And that's a point that I'd like to make that doesn't really come up in the film, and that is that at every stage, as Europe has pursued greater integration and are growing closer together, there have been strong forces on the continent that have been opposed to this. When the European Coal and Steel Community was set up, the idea was to share resources and share interdependence, the management of interdependence, in such a way that the great powers of Europe would never go to war with each other again. It's hard for us to remember, but Germany and France had been traditional enemies. They had fought one war after the other, right? That to most of us today is inconceivable, but in 1950, that was recent history. And so the ECSC was set up to try to reverse that trend. And in the construction of the ECSC, a series of institutions were created, a so-called higher authority, which is today's European Commission, a Common Assembly, which is today's European Parliament, a Court of Justice was set up. All of these institutions later matured within the European Economic Community and then emerged in the European Union. One example of the pushback, though, right, when these first institutions were set up, was that there had been a plan to create an integrated West European military force, right, the European Defense Force. The Cold War was in full bloom, and the idea was the Western powers, including the United States, would field armies that would be fully integrated. The French couldn't go for it, right? They had a huge domestic political battle, and in the end, we got the current configuration within the NATO alliance in which the armies still retain a great degree of autonomy. They cooperate with each other, and there's a hierarchy of command, but they are separate forces, not blended. The next step from the ECSC was the creation of the European Economic Community. And that was established in 1957, and the main task of the European Economic Community was to promote a more thoroughgoing economic integration of the member states. This body created, in effect, a customs union. And over the next 30 years, most of the Western European countries joined. So initially, in the early 50s, there were 6 cooperating countries. And by the 1980s, you had 30. And they were all organized in a customs union, which tends to have an integrating effect. If you look at the history of most of the independent states in Europe, if you look at Germany, for example, one of the first steps in the 19th century to construct a unified Germany was to first bind all of the little states that now comprise Germany into one unified customs union, right, and to integrate them economically. And so you could see the pattern being repeated here in the late 20th century on a Western European scale. And finally, after the end of the Cold War in 1993, the Maastricht Treaty established the European Union and created the notion, the idea of European citizenship. Or better put, it took the idea of European citizenship and made it a reality. The European Union comprised a wide range of institutions that includes a parliament, an executive body, the European Commission. It has a central bank, the ECB, and it has a court system. As we know, in 2002, amid much skepticism, they introduced their own currency, the euro, which is now used by 19 of the 28 members. It is now basically the second currency in the world. For a time, people were thinking it might sort of elbow the dollar out of the way. That hasn't happened yet, but you never know. Within the borders of the EU, people, goods, services, and capital can move without hindrance. The EU has a population of over 500 million and generates 22% of the world's gross domestic product. So, as we understand from the film, the EU is a real force in the globe, right? And in many ways, right, this process of integration that took place over 4 decades was an enormous success. And so I'd like to sketch out why I think this was so. Well, first of all, first and foremost, is the peace was preserved. Right? There has not been a major conflict in Europe since 1945, with the exception of the events that are going on now in Eastern Europe and the problems in the Balkans in the 1990s. Western Europe grew rich as economies after the war rebuilt and expanded as part of a process of increasing market integration. The European Community and the European Union both undertook enormous amounts of public investment, which stimulated the modernization of many economically underdeveloped regions, such as southern Italy. Europe became increasingly cosmopolitan, and this is really hard to exaggerate. That is, cross-border travel became easier, cultural exchange blossomed. Europeans now think nothing of moving from one side of the continent to the other. It has become a much more cosmopolitan place. Workers can move from one country to the other with relative ease, and they can be integrated into each country's system of taxation and social security without much difficulty. That cross-border movement, right, the idea of a constantly moving, constantly mixing population, 75 years ago, this was sort of unthinkable, right? It is now the norm. In Germany, it is considered an unbelievable disgrace to be forced to take your vacation in Germany. Okay. And so the question is, where to? Southern France, southern Italy, the Balkans, right? It's never Friesland, right? Anybody from Friesland here? Sorry. Also, the European legal system was integrated in many spheres. It had to be transformed to bring all of the states onto the same page. Following the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, the expansion of the European Union into Eastern Europe especially in 2004 when 10 former East Bloc countries joined. This facilitated the genuine reunification of the continent and began its economic integration with a larger whole. I'd like to just mention a couple of anecdotes to drive the point home. I go back and forth sometimes. I spend a lot of my time in the Rhineland, which allows me to go back and forth to France. And every time I'm in the high-speed train, right, going from, say, Frankfurt to Paris, or from Cologne to Paris, and you pass by the battlefields of the First World War, without being stopped on the border, without having any sense of moving from one country to the other, you can't believe that this was the same Europe that I experienced as a young student in the 1980s. Right? It is simply a marvel. Of course, when you get off the train, you know, the language switches from German to French, right? And you know you're in France. As soon as you go into your first cafe, it's different, right? Which is nice. But the movement, right, the freedom, the lack of obstacles, right, is so noticeable. Every one of us who's visited Europe, I think, has to see this. Another example I'll mention is a personal one. Let's see, I'm getting old now. So back in the 90s when my children were small, well, actually before then, in the late 80s, when the Cold War was still going on, I was working in the archives in West Germany, and I encountered a Hungarian woman with whom I became quite friendly, and then my family became friends with her family, and she came to visit us. She and her husband came to visit us in Binghamton, and we then went to Hungary and visited them. And when we were in Hungary and visited them, we met their daughter, who at the time was about 10 years old. And we made arrangements so that when the girl turned around 15 or so, she could come to Salem and go to South Salem High School. Right? So this, a few years later, when we had already moved to Salem, we had an opportunity, we had a new baby, and she had an opportunity to come to the United States, and we said, why don't you come here? She can go to South Salem, help us with the kid, and learn English. And so she came. And I want to describe the person that this young woman became, because that visit here was part of her parents' project for her. Okay, she was the object of a long-term plan, right? Her parents were extremely, let's say, opportunistic Hungarians. Okay, that means they looked for opportunities to enhance their economic position. In the Cold War, it was really hard to get what you wanted in the East Bloc. You had most of what you needed, but you didn't have what you wanted, right? And to get what you wanted, you had to learn how to bargain, right? And so whenever they came to the West, she was a sociologist and he was a literature professor. Whenever they came to the West, they would accumulate currency, they would accumulate certain kinds of goods, they would go back to Hungary and they would use this, they would leverage that into the things they needed for their apartments, right? Or resources for their kids, whatever, right? They were very skilled at that. And as the transformation occurred in 1989 and 1990, as the Cold War ended and Hungary entered into this new cosmopolitan Europe that was being created at that time, Lajos and Shoshana, the parents, understood that life, if you really wanted to have opportunities in this world, it was going to be very difficult to have the full gamut of opportunity if you remain locked in a Hungarian milieu. Okay, you had to become a cosmopolitan citizen of Europe, right? And so they sent her to the United States to learn English, and when she was done here, they sent her to Germany to learn German, and when she was done there, they sent her to Sweden to learn Swedish, they sent her to law school, okay, and now she is a Hungarian official who lives in Brussels, and her job is to bring into line the laws of the EU and the Hungarian law, right? So she got a job in the foreign ministry as a lawyer in the foreign ministry, essentially working in Brussels. And she is a person who is at home in 4 or 5 different languages. Since she's lived in Brussels now for so long, she also speaks French. So she can go anywhere, right? In Europe, she's multilingual, multicultural. The only stipulation from her mother was that she had to marry a Hungarian, right? Which she did. So some of these old traditions still linger, okay? But she is in some ways sort of the classic example of what at least some people hope to create in the construction of the European citizen, truly European person. Okay. Now, I've just provided a litany of all the good things. Now I want to talk about the poison pill. Right? And to my mind, the poison pill of the European project is neoliberal ideology and the policies that flow from that. The construction of the European coal and steel community and the EEC took place during what we call the 30 glorious years of the post-war era, at the height of social democracy's political influence, when center-left and center-right political currents all used different versions of Keynesian policy to guide capitalist expansion and promote employment. At the same time, they also provided a wide range of social benefits and guaranteed social insurance to give people opportunity, for example, with expanded educational possibilities, and also security, right, through the provision of generous health care, pensions, and unemployment insurance. Right? So for 30 years after the war, you had very large-scale economic growth, okay, lots of new employment, and lots of social benefits. That period came to an end with the economic stagnation of the 1970s and the advent of neoliberal economic policies in the age of Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher in Britain, and Helmut Kohl in Germany. The neoliberals aimed to tame inflation and, and promote economic growth by pursuing tight money policies, shrinking the social state, and privatizing state-owned assets and services. By the mid-1980s, these policies had taken hold across much of the continent, and the social democratic model was in retreat. Indeed, by the 1990s, social democrats such as Tony Blair in England and Gerhard Schroeder in Germany, their counterpart was Bill Clinton in the United States, these people were leading their parties rightward and infusing neoliberal ideas into the social democratic agenda. In attempting to broaden their support among the middle classes, they largely turned their backs on their traditional working class constituencies. In a sense, the latter was cast adrift. Okay, they were cast adrift politically. And many of these people are now the people who are casting about, okay, looking for a political home, looking for a political movement that will defend what they perceive as their interests. It is crucial to remember that the European Union was created in 1993 just as neoliberalism was in full flower. So the context, that isn't even mentioned here in this film. The context of the construction of the Union in the late 80s and early 90s was neoliberal economic policy. Thus, the European Union's financial system and economic policies were developed under very conservative economic auspices. Its economic policies have been much more about tight money, sharp limitations on deficit financing, market expansion and market integration, instead of promoting full employment, economic equality, and social security. The most recent manifestations of the European Union's stress on free trade was the Transatlantic and Investment Pact, the TTIP thing they were talking about, which is now bogged down, and the recently signed Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with Canada, CETA, that was signed in October. These agreements greatly enhance the power of capital, often at the expense of average people and localities unprepared for the dislocations new arrangements might bring. Meanwhile, the provisions of the European Social Charter, which provide a wide array of guarantees in the spheres of housing, labor, health, and education, as well as protections against discrimination, these are not made mandatory in all the member states and are very unevenly applied. So on the one hand, right, the European Union leadership has assiduously pursued free trade. Okay? On the other hand, they have talked about the social charter, okay, but they have not seen fit to really implement the social charter. Right? So on the one hand, they make real the integrated market, but they don't make real the social promise of the European Union. Thus, over the course of the last 23 years, the European economy, like the North American one in the North American Free Trade Agreement, has grown and become more integrated, but its fruits have been very unequally distributed. Many workers have been left behind as capital has become more mobile in the search for lower costs and higher profits. Meanwhile, the increased mobility of workers has intensified competition in some areas and stoked rising xenophobia in some places. So I regard that framework that I just described, right, as the fundamental problem that the EU is now facing. But there are some other ones, so I'll just outline those quickly. And these are long-standing problems, right, that are now, in a sense, coming home to roost because first the European Economic Community in the 70s and 80s, right, but now the EU, they've been unable to grapple with them in a unified way. So the first additional problem I think is very important is the frequent failure of European Union member states to develop a unified foreign policy. This was very clear in the 1990s when it came to formulating a policy to prevent the breakup of Yugoslavia, okay? And now we see it in terms of EU policy in regard to, say, the wars in the Middle East, right, or immigration. Secondly, another major problem is the failure to deal in a unified fashion with large-scale external immigration from the war zones of the Middle East and from the impoverished parts of Africa. So it is true that many of the refugees we are seeing on television are coming from Syria. Right? But there's also a very large influx of people coming from sub-Saharan Africa who come across the Sahara Desert. They get to the North African coast in Libya or Morocco, wherever, and then they try to get into the European Union. Interestingly, if you go to the coast here of Morocco, there's a little city called Ceuta, which is an outpost of Spanish power on the North African coast. It's surrounded by a high fence. And every once in a while, a mob of non-Europeans attack the fence, knock it over, and get into the city. As soon as they get into the city, they're on European soil, and then they have to be adjudicated accordingly. Right? So they, in a way, this is the European Union's version of, at least maybe in the minds of Donald Trump, our southern border. Now, many states were also unwilling to cede enough sovereignty to ensure that the European Union's institutions have sufficient power. That came up in the film, and that's especially true when it comes to the European Central Bank. The European Central Bank is a key institution in the Union, and its job, its charge, is to maintain price stability. Where does this come from? Primarily the Germans. Okay? I always like to come back to the Germans. And the Germans, because they were the strongest economic power in the Union when the Union was formed, they had a lot of clout in determining what the terms were going to be for the establishment of these new institutions. And the Germans always have in their mind the great hyperinflation of 1923 and the second great hyperinflation of 1948. And they don't want to experience that again. And so their traditional policy, their money policy has traditionally been tight money, okay, strict control over prices, and they were terribly afraid that the bank would wind up, God help us, in the hands of the French. And so that's why the bank was located in Frankfurt, okay, and that's why it was initially sort of under German auspices. Now, the bank, if it was given enhanced powers, so for example to promote employment, okay, might be able to do quite a bit to improve the situation of people in different parts of the Union. But right now, its charge is quite limited. So the film talked a bit about this, right, about how the issue of sovereignty remains an important one. And many of the European countries are unwilling to cede enough authority to different institutions of the Union to make them function better. For many people also, the European Union's institutions seem distant, bureaucratic, and undemocratic. Now, there's no question that it is a large bureaucratic entity. It is a government representing 500 million people. It is so by nature bureaucratic. But it's also a very easy target because sometimes they do dopey things, right? So, for example, the government is in 3 places. I can only remember 2 of them, Strasbourg and Brussels, right? Which means they have to move the government around quite a bit, right? They have to hold a certain number of sessions in Brussels, a certain number of sessions in Strasbourg. There are different functions at different places. All of this costs a fortune to manage. And there are many, many agencies in the EU that deal with a wide variety of issues across the continent, consumer-related issues, environmental-related issues. And so suddenly when you're setting up your company or trying to produce a product, right, and you have to engage with EU rules, many people find this incredibly annoying, sometimes expensive, right? And they hold it against the EU. And often the EU doesn't do a good enough job explaining why these things are necessary, right? And who is actually paying for what. So, for example, when the British were campaigning, when the Leave camp was campaigning against the EU, they constantly talked about all of the money flowing out of Britain to pay for the bureaucracy in Brussels. But of course, then they don't mention that basically every cow in Scotland comes with a $600 EU subsidy, right? That now London is going to have to pay for. So the EU carries out many crucial functions via that bureaucracy, right? But it doesn't do a very good job of communicating to people how the thing works and who's responsible and so on. And a great deal of distance has developed between average people in the street and this enormous edifice in Brussels that seems very far away. So if you take all these problems, these long-standing problems together, you can see that even though the EU has had many, many very important successes, right, there are also lots of problems that have to be dealt with so that it would not lose its legitimacy over time. Okay, so I see that the clock is at 25 after. And it might be a good time now for me to take a break, or I could field a couple of questions. We could take a break. What would you like to do? Okay. Jeanette says break, so you're free to go. This brings us to the contemporary crisis faced by the European Union. And I wanted to start off by talking about how, in many ways, it reminds me of the retreat of democracy in Europe at the end of the 1920s and the early 1930s. You might recall that at the end of World War I, there was a wave of democratic transformation across Europe, so that by 1920, 1921, almost all of the European states, with the exception of the Soviet Union, were parliamentary democracies of one kind or the other. However, by the end of the 1920s, that situation began to experience a reverse. And we know that in the early 1930s, basically authoritarianism was on the march in much of Europe, culminating in the Second World War. Now, I don't want to be too alarmist, right? And the situation is much different. There is no Great Depression at the moment. In fact, the economy, the world economy is doing relatively well. The European economy is in pretty good shape, by and large. We don't want to draw too close a parallel. However, I dare say that since the early 90s, right, when we were talking about the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama used to say, right, the victory of liberal democracy, right, the establishment of the capitalist democracy as the model, right, that was going to be projected everywhere in the world, this is now all changed. Okay, many of the visions of the early 1990s are much tempered, right, by events in recent years. And I'll talk about some of those now for the next few minutes. One of the biggest problems facing the European Union and many European governments in general, and the American government for that matter, is the loss of legitimacy. Many people have increasingly come to see the European Union as responsible for many of their economic problems and for the swift cultural changes taking place within their midst. And so, when you think of many of the changes that have occurred in our country in the last 15 to 20 years, we've always had, or at least since the 1960s, we've had large numbers of immigrants coming into the country. We regard ourselves as a country of immigrants, for the most part. At least we mythologize that. And so that makes us somewhat different than many of the European states. However, there's no doubt that in the United States in recent years, a lot of people have been unnerved by some of the cultural changes we've been experiencing. Who could have predicted 20 years ago that today gay marriage would be legal across the country, right? Many social issues, the issues of transgender, the issues of all of the various minorities that today feel themselves under threat, right? Or are trying to assert their rights in our society. For many people, these developments in the last few years are a sign of our progress. But as I was telling my students not long ago, watch out, okay? Because the Supreme Court can enforce law, okay? But that doesn't mean that everybody is with the Supreme Court. That doesn't mean that the vast majority of the people are comfortable with the changes they're experiencing going on around them. The Europeans are in the same situation. Their societies are, in many cases, undergoing very rapid change. Many communities, it's true, what that official said, I think he was from one of the human rights organizations, he pointed out that a continent of 500 million people can easily absorb 1 million or more refugees. He's right, they can, if they pursue the absorption of those people in a way that is organized and makes sense. But what has happened in recent years is that the migrants have come in waves, they have not been dealt with rationally, and as a result, they have wound up settling in some places in very large numbers, in other places not at all. And so there are places in Bavaria, for example, villages of 500 residents that suddenly find themselves having to put up 2, 3, 4, 500 migrants in their midst, right? And this creates this unnerves the people. Even when they want to be helpful, it unnerves them. The whole cultural milieu changes overnight, right? Many people dive into the exercise with great enthusiasm, with energy, right? And they seek out resources and try and help the new people who are arriving. Other people are simply made uncomfortable, and other people get angry, right? So people react in different ways to these kinds of changes. And we're talking about, in some places, changes of a very large scale. So the EU has been unable to grapple, right, with some of these changes rapidly. I've mentioned immigration, but some of these changes also have to do with other spheres of social life, gay rights, for example, and many people in many countries are uncomfortable with this. I'll give you another example. The EU has a range of provisions, right, in its legal system preventing discrimination against people for all sorts of reasons, right, including sexual orientation. There are some countries in Eastern Europe where this is anathema. They don't want to hear it, okay? Poland, for example, which is now being run by a right-wing Catholic party. They would like to detach themselves from that element of union politics. So for many people, their economic situation is one thing. These other cultural, social changes are other things that have led them to question the efficacy of the EU and question its legitimacy. And also sometimes question their own governments, that is, the mainstream parties that have allowed EU policy to be implemented. There is also a major regional divide between the rich northern European countries, especially Germany, and the relatively poor south. The Germans have pursued a particularly hard line regarding the granting of credits to heavily indebted countries like Greece. By insisting that the Greeks pursue a policy of austerity in return for loans, the Germans are widely held responsible for the depth of the depression that has afflicted Greece for years And the current unemployment level in Greece is about 25%. Right? So, I want you to imagine if tomorrow in the United States we had an unemployment rate of 25% and the state was reducing expenditures, right, in the social categories. You would be inflamed. Right? When we had that problem in the 1930s, we got the New Deal. Okay? The Greeks are being told, no New Deal. Suck it up. Right? Why? So you can pay the German banks. Right? Now, as the fellow in the film pointed out, the German finance minister is right that the Greeks were over-indebted and were not paying their debts, they were not paying on time, and so on. But he was also right that the Germans lent the money, okay? They lent the money because they thought the profits would be good. They took a risk, and now there's a price to be paid. In any case, the northern countries, right, tend to be much stronger economically than the southern countries. The northern countries tend to export high-end, high-value products. The southern countries tend to export basically agricultural products, raw materials. Right? It's a kind of miniature global economy within the EU. And the way the EU is structured right now is that the northern countries benefit a great deal. The southern countries benefit less so. The southern countries are dependent on the northern countries for their financing, and this has led to tremendous tensions in the EU as a whole. Perhaps it's worth mentioning here that this also is similar to the 1920s. There was a famous economist named Karl Polanyi who wrote a book in 1944 called The Great Transformation. And that book pointed out how the reason why, well, one of the reasons why we got the Great Depression was because after the First World War, the Western powers were insistent on going back to the gold standard and holding onto the gold standard. Okay? This limited their financial flexibility to meet the challenge of the Depression, and the result was essentially austerity politics. Okay. Well, we don't have the gold standard anymore, but we have German-backed tight money. Okay? And in effect, German-backed tight money and the rules that apply in the EU finance system created by the conservatives in the early 1990s that limit what a government can do, deficit spending, for example, okay? These limit the ways in which the European Union can respond to its economic challenges. Right? So we see ourselves faced with a range of problems inside the EU that are more complicated than just talking about economic growth. You have uneven development. You have lots of areas that have benefited from the overall growth and lots that have not. Okay? You have some countries that are able to make all kinds of public investments and others that cannot. The ones that cannot are often limited by the financial rules, okay, imposed on the EU system when this system was created in the early 1990s. And my argument will be that those financial constraints have to be lifted. There has also been a reaction, or I should say that the reaction against the supranational EU institutions has taken on various forms. One form is that people are ceasing to vote. So right now, a typical EU election gets a very low turnout of about 42%. So people are stopping, they're not paying attention. And that varies from place to place. In some places it's in the teens, right? So it's a serious problem. Equally as importantly, popular unrest has led to the rise of nationalist movements in Britain, in France, in the Netherlands, in Germany, in Poland, and elsewhere, in Hungary. In some countries, such as Hungary, the nationalists are in power, and they are pushing back against the EU and many of the civil rights assumptions of the post-war age. Alongside these nationalist parties, in some places, are openly fascist formations, such as Jobbik in Hungary and Golden Dawn in Greece. Now, the problem with some of these nationalist parties is, on the one hand, their politics in practice. So what is the Hungarian Nationalist Party doing right now? It's using language like, we are a Christian country, therefore we need to keep out foreign elements, therefore we can put a fence up along our border. Therefore, we can require that all migrants who come into Hungary, right, need to be put in detention camps. This is now part of the discourse right, that is being promoted by the government of Hungary. That opens the door to an even more extreme discourse, okay? The discourse of anti-Semitism, a radical anti-Islamic discourse, okay? So what has happened is the move to the right, okay, the general move to the right, has opened the door to the extreme right. Okay, does that sound familiar? Right? Okay. So this is a European-wide phenomenon. These right-wing movements have built support by using nationalist rhetoric, promoting cultural discrimination against outsiders, especially Muslims, but also Jews, Roma people, Africans. Depending on where they are, they have attacked the EU for over-regulating the economy, for interfering with people's lives, and draining resources from the community. They promote a wide range of economic policies, some of which are laissez-faire. So some of these parties have a wing, a kind of laissez-faire wing, a radical libertarian wing. But they also contain elements, right, that are highly protectionist, right, or would like to use the state to defend the interests of very specific social groups, like workers. So, in other words, they are ideologically incoherent, right, which is very similar to the fascist movements of the 1930s. Some of them aim to create a core Eurozone that would kick out the poor states, while others want to drop the euro altogether. Brexit was a manifestation of the fury of many average people against the system they felt, whether rightly or wrongly, was not working in their interests. Many people are unhappy with their economic situation in a rapidly changing economic environment, and others are unnerved by rapid changes in their cultural milieu. And the demagogues, people like Nigel Farage in Britain and Boris Johnson, right? These people fed upon people's fears and attacked multiculturalism and attacked the EU, appealing to the nostalgia of a Britain long past, right? Make Britain great again, so to speak. Okay, so now, you know, I started out praising the EU to the skies, right? Now I've dampened everybody's ardor here. Everybody looks depressed. Right? Okay. So now let's look at the future. Now it gets dangerous for historians. Okay. So in preparing these remarks, I looked at a variety of things, and among the sources I was looking at was a white paper on the future of Europe that was prepared by the European Commission. And then I looked at another paper that was prepared by the European Network for Alternative Thinking and Political Dialogue. So these two papers come from very different political perspectives. And what I found interesting was that although their starting points are different, their assessment of the possible roads forward was basically the same. So there are essentially 5 possible roads forward, I think. And one of them has kind of a couple of sub-roads. Right? So the first 4 are pretty straightforward. The first one is the European Union can muddle through with more fiscal flexibility and more public investment. Right? So this is the position being represented by lots of mainstream social democrats and a few other left-oriented political formations. There's a guy in Germany, this is how bad it's gotten. In Germany, they didn't know who was going to be the leading candidate in the parliamentary elections against Angela Merkel. The woman has been there forever, right? And the Social Democrats, they have a lot of good people in their leadership, I suppose, but nobody who's very dynamic, nobody who's very charismatic, and I don't think anybody really wanted to go head-to-head with Angela Merkel, especially in this mess that we now have. But they found this guy named Martin Schulz, who was the head of the Social Democratic Party fraction in the European Parliament. And I thought when I first heard that, oh God, it's over, right? But in fact, he has proven to be a fairly dynamic figure, and he talks a lot like an old-time Social Democrat, okay? Meaning we have to help workers, right? We have to make public investments in education and in all these sectors that many people feel have been neglected by the neoliberal approach. And so he's doing pretty well now in the polls. Now, it's people like him, right, who are supporting this muddling through, okay, with relaxed fiscal rules and more public investment. Because the idea here is that sort of across the continent, we can do more to help people and make them feel like the EU is working for them. Right? So it's a kind of classic social democratic approach. Second option is that the EU can muddle through, okay, the way it's been going, essentially, except they need to tighten and restrict immigration controls. Okay, and this is the position of many of the right-of-center parties right now, the Christian Democratic parties, Angela Merkel's own party, for example. They are already imposing border controls. The Hungarians are building a fence, barbed wire fence. So this is the policy, one might say, is currently in force in places like Germany, Austria, and Hungary. They refer to them as temporary border controls, right? But nobody really knows how temporary they will be. A third option is that the EU could jettison its relatively poor areas and consolidate around an ethnically homogeneous core European zone in which neoliberal integration continues using the euro. This position is supported by groups like the right-wing Alternative for Germany, which has been scoring very well in state elections in Germany, and also the FPO, a party in Austria, okay, which represents the same position. Now, there are some groups, the Northern League in Italy, for example, that they don't want to have anything to do with the euro any longer. They would like to cast off Southern Italy, right, and then build a new economic formation around Northern Italy. Okay, Northern Italy is much richer than Southern Italy. So, again, these are the politics of fragmentation, sort of pulling in, right, and hunkering down and keeping out those you think are weak, and using the currency you think will promote your own interests best. A fourth possibility is that the European Union could be transformed into a so-called Europe of nations, characterized by a single market and linked economic regulations, while there could be some targeted regional investment in such an arrangement. Most other policies would be pursued on a national basis. So, for example, migration and asylum policy would be national policies. There would be, instead of the EU negotiating on behalf of all 28 countries, foreign policy would be carried out on a more bilateral level. Okay. This is the outlook of the Fidesz party in Hungary, now in power. It is also the outlook of the Law and Justice Party in Poland, also in power. So those first four scenarios move, in my view, from sort of moderately hopeful to rather bleak. However, the fifth one is the one I like, right? This has been put forward by the European left. Well, actually, the European left has put forward basically two responses. One response, the one I like the most, is it calls for a democratic refoundation of the European Union that would create a democratic and federalist union. We don't have a federal system now, we have a confederacy, right? And that's the problem. As I think it was Jeffrey Sachs said, it's very similar to the mess we had in the 1780s with the Articles of Confederation. So we need to reestablish a federalist union, and this would open spaces for a more equitable mode of integration. Now, the problem is that this model runs against all the current political trends, and it would be very difficult to achieve. It would be the most complicated one to achieve in some ways. So it's the most challenging, but it's the one I think would be best. The other option, second best, is to advocate a more pro-social agenda within the current system, challenging European Union regulatory schemes, okay, such as fiscal policy, and if possible, abandoning the euro to promote needed change in certain places. So, in other words, try to make real the potential, the promise of the European Social Charter, which I mentioned to you earlier. Unlike the economic agreements and regulations that the EU has pursued, okay, the Social Charter has not been enforced across the board. Okay, the countries can sort of pick and choose. Britain said it will never sign. Right? So we need to make the provisions of the social charter real. Now, whether such policies can be accomplished is, of course, reliant on the political power of the European left. It will be interesting to see if the socialists, the Greens, and their other allies can unite, not just to fend off the extreme right, but to set Europe on a new course that would realize its full potential for everyone. So now we have about 20 minutes or half an hour for questions. I'm happy to field any.
This is Bob. You hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Bob, Bill, the question I have relates to Germany. If it pursued and I'm only testing your assertion here, I'm not disagreeing with it, I just wanted to understand. Through tight money policy, it developed an economy that is the most robust in Europe. It worked, and it has a social program too. It's by American standards anyway, much more of a social democratic country.
Right.
If it worked for Germany, why shouldn't it work elsewhere within Europe?
Well, again, work is a malleable term. Okay, so for example, what actually happened in Germany was they went down the neoliberal road beginning in the 1990s, big time, even the Social Democrats, right? And they rolled back many of the most generous aspects of their welfare state. Okay, everybody uses these euphemisms. Okay, they kicked people off. Well, they don't say that. They say we are making the labor market more flexible. This means it makes it easier to fire people. Okay, and it makes it easier to keep people off the welfare rolls. Right. So they have cut the level of welfare support for many people. It's still, by American standards, very generous. Okay, and they have attempted to basically force people back into the labor market, okay, and force them to work for low wages. Now, one other option for German economic policy would be to loosen the fiscal reins, to promote to reflate the economy, and to raise demand. Okay, and they have not pursued that. What they have done is they have pursued an export-oriented approach that has worked in terms of maintaining very positive balance payments. Yes, Germany is in relative good shape. The German skilled working class earns quite well, but they have a big cleft in the population. Their unskilled workers and their underemployed people are. Oh, sorry. Okay. Their unskilled workers and their underemployed people are actually approaching American-level conditions, right? So most of the people I know in Germany who are looking for a change of tack, they want the economy to be reflated. They want to increase the inflation rate, right? Increase demand, right? Internally, right? Rather than focus on this export-oriented approach.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
You've talked a lot about Germany, and in light of Marine Le Pen's inroads in France, how does that play into all of these 5 scenarios that you have just outlined for us?
Yeah, well, if Marine Le Pen wins, then we could get one of the more nationalist versions of the five options I outlined. I think this idea of Europe of nations would appeal to her group, right? She has promised, it's very interesting, she's promised on the one hand to pull France out of the Eurozone, to get France out of the EU, and also to protect the interests of workers, to improve the welfare state for French workers and so on. She is pursuing a populist line, right, making all kinds of promises to people that she probably can't keep in terms of concrete benefits and so on, employment. And she's pursuing using a nationalist rhetoric, using the EU as the boogeyman, And what we would get, I suspect, is a ratcheting up of French xenophobia, very exclusionary policy. I don't know exactly what she would do, right, to manage the French North African population. In France, one of the largest minority populations comes from Algeria, right, and the former colonies of West Africa. And these people are marginalized in French society in the same way that certain minorities are marginalized in the United States. Okay? And the French are not very successful at their integration. I assume that under her regime, we would have a policy of exclusion that would try to push them out. Right? How that would work, I don't know.
Bill, it's Don. I have a political question more so than a historical question, and it's applicable both to Europe and this country. You talked about neoliberal parties and their austerity measures designed in part to reduce deficits. On the other hand, you have social democratic parties who want to perpetuate the social programs and perhaps have new public investments in some areas.
Right.
And social democrats, and historically, a lot of what has happened in Europe has been financed through deficits.
Mm-hmm.
And you can argue that in a country like Greece, which is in a time of crisis, like our Great Depression, you can't focus on balancing the budget when you have 25% unemployment. But at the same time, deficits of the nature that we've seen in Europe and this country are not sustainable in the long term. The demographics in a lot of Western European countries are, you have a worker base that's shrinking,
Mm-hmm.
and these have to support pensions for an aging population, more and more people retiring. So the retiree base is swelling, the worker base is shrinking, and one cannot finance the other at the current, sustainable basis.
Right.
At the current rate. I'm not sure what the solution to this is. It seems to me in Europe this would be even more complicated by the fact that, again, you have several different countries, several different economic situations,
Mm-hmm.
From Greece on the one hand to Germany on the other. But to continue with deficit financing as part of an overall model, I mean, we're pushing our debts down to our grandkids and forcing our grandkids to pay for things that we're trying to do right now. Could you talk about that?
Okay, there are a number of things that in your comments that could be separated from one another. One of them is talking about the situation in Greece, say, or in some of the other southern European countries. One response might be, well, certainly the Germans had far fewer compunctions about pouring money, okay, into East Germany when unification occurred 20 years ago, running gigantic deficits to do it, right? And they rebuilt East Germany, right? And it's true that a few people gratzed a little, right? But they did it, right? And in the end, most people think that was the right thing, right? So they took a country that was essentially on its knees, that was a pile of rubble, that was in tremendous debt, and they refurbished it, reconstructed it, and allowed a lot of its people to move from the east to the west to absorb them, right? So that was actually the basic solution. Eastern Germany became in part emptied out, sort of like South Dakota. Well, I mean, that's how we solve our problems, don't we? I mean, if you have people who live in rural areas and there's nothing for them to do there, and there are things for them to do in other areas, they move from place to place. We have a gigantic continent-wide economy. People do it in the United States all the time. We solve a lot of our problems in that framework, right? So the Germans solved their problem by absorbing the unemployed East Germans essentially into the West German economy. Many of the young, trained East Germans who couldn't find anything in the East went to the West and have done quite well. Some parts of the East are now recovering. Other parts of the East are dead, right? So if the Europeans, and now you might say, well, the Germans, those are their fellow countrymen. They love one another, right? Well, my friends, right? We're all Europeans now, okay? We all love one another, right? So why can't rich Europe help poor Europe? Why can't the North, okay, which is, the Germans are producing right now very large surpluses. Their economy is in fine shape. If they ran some deficits, it wouldn't hurt them very much. As Keynes once said, right, in the long run, we're all dead, right? So you know, certainly in regard to Greece, the current, I would argue that the current draconian program is short-sighted and cruel, right? And I'm not saying that the Greeks ought to be able to all go to the Riviera, right? But certainly, if you want to keep them in the EU zone, then you have to be willing to do what it takes to uplift those parts of the zone that are not doing well. That has, in fact, for the past 40 years, been EU policy, right? So when Poland and the Eastern European countries were brought in, they were not allowed simply to enter into the Union willy-nilly because they wanted to. They had to demonstrate that they had achieved a certain level of development. And the only way they could achieve those levels of development was through transfers from the West. So the EU oversaw very substantial capital transfers to raise the infrastructure level in the East to the point where it was at least comparable with the West, plus they had to do other things in their legal system, and so on and so forth. So I would argue that there are other options to dealing with Greece and southern Italy and so on that could be accomplished within the framework of the EU if you have the political will. And your last point about the problem of shrinking populations, that is the shrinking of the working population, the growth of the retired population. I see you out there. Okay, right? All of these problems, right? Well, what do they point to really? They point to the sickness of a system that can only survive if it grows. You cannot, I mean, the solution to your problem is to create more people, okay? To crank out more little consumers, right? And more little workers, right? So that the system that has worked for the past 150, 200 years through growth that is only oriented around continued, never-ending growth can continue, okay? And I would argue that that system, like any other organism, right, our social system cannot grow forever. It will lead to a crash at some point. I don't know when it's going to happen. Right? The only way we've been able to go from 1 billion people, or 1.6 billion in 1900, right, to, what is it now? 7.5, 8 billion, is through the agricultural revolution carried out by the fixing of nitrates from the air, okay, which allowed us to use artificial fertilizers, which are poisoning the planet. Right? I mean, it's a long story. We all know it's complicated. But my point is that the problem is one of the system. Your question there, that is a systemic question. Right? How can you, without raising the number of people being produced, right, how can you keep producing enough workers that are going to pay into the welfare systems? Right? And unless you change the system, then you're going to have a crisis. Right? So I have no answers other than that. If we want to talk about some socialist solutions, that's another talk sometime.